I had been writing these very bleak grimdark novels, which, as I say, I mean, people often say they're very nihilistic. I think they're about people trying to cope. A lot of them are actually about people trying to find ways of carrying on and ways of living in a world where there's not hope. One of the things for me about grimdark is that it gets rid of that kind of very simplistic, there are goodies and there are baddies, and we know the goodies are going to win.
Welcome to Fantasy and Faith, where Muslim storytelling meets myth and magic, weaving faith, history, and imagination into unforgettable worlds. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce my guest, Anna Smith Spark, the Queen of Grimdark, a PhD in English literature. She has been critically acclaimed and nominated a bunch of times for various awards, including a 2018 Gemmell Award and two 2018 British Fantasy Awards for The Court of Broken Knives, and the 2019 Campbell Astounding Award, and most recently has been shortlisted for a World Fantasy Award for the novella In the Shadow of Their Dying, co-authored with Michael F. Fletcher. Her books include the Empires of Dust trilogy. Is that Gemmell thing? I keep slipping into Druss. So the Empires of Dust trilogy, the Anderson versus Death Judge Dredd novel, which I found out about during the British Fantasy Online Worldcon event that we were both at, and I thought, wow, she wrote a Judge Dredd novel. And A Sword of Bronze and Ashes. She's also a member of the British Fantasy Society. So welcome to the show, Anna, and please tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, yes, my name's Anna Smith Spark. Yes, I'm the author of the Empires of Dust trilogy, The Court of Broken Knives, The Tower of Living and Dying, The House of Sacrifice, which is big, multi-point of view, grimdark epic fantasy, world, sort of continent-spanning battles, world conquerors, magic, dragons. It's often accused of nihilism, but I don't think that's entirely fair. I think it is fundamentally a nihilistic world, but a lot of it, some of the people in it, it's about that kind of striving for, well, what does it mean to try and care in a living in an nihilistic world? How does one find some kind of peace with that and find some kind of, and love and care for people within that? A novel called A Woman of the Sword, which was a kind of sort of sequel to that. So that's about a woman and her children in the aftermath of those kind of big, huge continent-spanning epic fantasy battles, and just how one lives or tries to live in a ruined, violent, broken world, and how one tries to parent children in a world which places no value on care and on love. And yes, my most recent books, A Sword of Bronze and Ashes, and coming out, this is the Arc, coming out in September, so around now, A Sword of Gold and Ruin, which they're very kind of Celtic, they're heavily influenced by the Ulster cycle of myth. So they're very kind of Celtic, they're much more folk horror, folklore, but also high fantasy. And they're very much about a mother, a woman, her relationship with her husband, with her children, with her world. They're very much about what does it mean to be a good person, and what kind of, and they are actually very kind of pantheist books. I think they're very spiritual books. I think a lot of kind of my own belief and feelings about the world and about what does it mean to live in the world and morality and faith and things are really strongly in them. So yes, and also my completely insane In the Shadow of Their Dying, which again it's comedy horror. How far can you go? How far is too far? Zombie horror grimdark. But again, there is stuff in there that I'm trying to say about kind of, again, that we've got people in a city and pushed to the kind of absolute limits of insane kind of violence and total insanity. And again, it's this stuff about what does it mean to care for people? What does it mean to try to be in that world and to try and find a way, try and find meaning for your life? And the Judge Anderson versus Judge Dredd, which I cannot believe I got to write a Judge Dredd novel. I've got social media stuff with like Instagram posted stuff, the official 2000 AD Instagram account was posting stuff about me, and I cannot believe that has happened to me.
Actually grew up during my teenage years reading 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog and all of those. So when I came up during the BFS event, I was like, "Whoa, she's written a Judge Dredd novel."
Same. It was kind of the classic thing. I had a slightly older friend who was really into it, and of course, when it's boy a couple of years older than you, he seems cool anyway. So obviously, everything connected with him must be cool. So this was just like way before I'd read it. It was like, okay, this is obviously the coolest thing in the world. So yeah, to see my name on it is just unbelievable. To write those characters, it's absolutely unbelievable.
So well, let's go to our first proper question. A Sword of Bronze and Ashes feels like a myth unearthed, half remembered, and wholly alive. What inspired the tone and mythic quality of this story, and how does it connect to the world of Grimdark you've helped define?
Oh my goodness! Oh, I helped to define Grimdark. Actually, Wikipedia certainly says I did. Actually, yeah, no, it came out of trying to find more hope for myself. I think actually more hope for the world. So it was a post-COVID novel. A Woman of the Sword was written at the end of COVID lockdown when I had space to write, and that was very much a novel about it. Yeah, kind of women and children living through this kind of really difficult time, and this sort of sense of panic and horror and not. I mean, there was a point during COVID when it kind of felt like this, when people were saying this is the new normal, as if somehow children not going to school, children being shut in the house with their parents, shops closing, no cinema. I remember someone saying, well, every winter we'll just be having to be indoors all the time. And that, not seeing our families and things because it's too dangerous to see. And Woman of the Sword came out of that. And then when the world was getting back to normal, I suppose I consciously did want to write something that was more hopeful. I had been writing these very bleak, grimdark novels, which, as I say, I mean, people often say they're very nihilistic. I think they're about people trying to cope. A lot of them are actually about people trying to find ways of carrying on and ways of living in a world where there's not hope. One of the things for me about Grimdark is that it gets rid of that kind of very simplistic, there are goodies and there are baddies, and we know the goodies are going to win trope that so much of epic fantasy has, that no matter, in sort of the Lord of the Rings, no matter how dark it gets, that in the end they are going to win. You know that Sauron will be defeated. And a lot of epic fantasy really has that. So I wanted... Grimdark for me is partly an exploration of that. It's about how you live in a real world in which there's a very strong possibility that something awful is going to happen and there is no way of recovering from that. Or, if you're living in Ukraine, or you're living in Gaza, or you're living in Sudan, the chance of there being a happy ending and somehow we can all just say, well, that was a really dark time, but now everything's okay, is probably virtually nil, And so how do you live? How do you actually live and find some kind of hope and meaning and something to hold on to in a real world, essentially? So my grimdark novels were very much about that. And then with A Sword of Bronze and Ashes, I did consciously want to write something which was more hopeful, which was more about the idea that there can be good. I remember once saying to someone, I was increasingly felt that evil probably exists, but I'm not. I can't help feeling good possibly doesn't, which was a very bleak feeling. But I mean, that was I think I said that in about 2018, and there were possibly reasons at that point, geopolitical reasons and personal reasons why I was feeling like that. But to try and feel some kind of sense of good does exist. There is something good in this. There is much good in this world, and it is worth fighting for. So that was where A Sword of Bronze Ashes came from. It was trying to write something good and trying to write in Kanda, the protagonist, a woman who is not a kind of raw confessional reflection of me thinking about myself and seeing myself in that very kind of raw negative way that writers tend to do when they're writing, exploring their own inner feelings, but trying to write a character who is the kind of person I'd like to be. So she was actually drawn quite heavily on women I know who I admire. And I'm sure if they were to sort of say, well, I'm sure if they were to write about themselves, they'd be much more confessional and say a lot more negative things about themselves. But I was trying to write about the way I see people I admire and the way I'd like to be. So almost challenge myself at times. No, don't write what you do or you think you do in these situations. Write what you'd like to do in these situations. And it was also written with a much more, I guess, it does have a kind of pantheistic sense of God in the world. And that was something that is at the heart of the way I actually do. That's absolutely the heart of my spiritual experience. But it also came from, it opens in a river valley, which is a real place in Derbyshire. It's a place called it's a little village called Overhaddon, just outside Bakewell. And there's a very beautiful little river there, which is famous for trout fishing. And I was on holiday there in the first spring when COVID was actually kind of beginning to be over and lockdown had ended. I was there with my parents and my children, and we were sitting in this beautiful green, fresh, lush, rich landscape, just full of life, with my parents, with my children, having this really lovely meal. There's a little sort of restaurant pub there, and we were sitting, having this lovely meal in the sunshine, looking at just life. There are all these little sheep and flowers and trees and grass and sun and bird song, and my children laughing and my parents laughing. And that sense of, which for me is, a credible kind of, I don't believe in an interventionist God, but I believe that, there is something utterly sacred and important and profoundly good in that moment, and that, in the flowers, in the life, in the sound of my children laughing and my parents laughing with them. And I wanted to write that and put that down and sort of set that into words, that yes, lots of dark things happen in the book. It's about someone who has a great deal of dark in their past and has has a lot of complexity in her personality. It's not a book where, it's not saying the world is simple, but it's saying those moments of life and joy and happiness are more than, they are more than just a kind of, gosh, this is a nice landscape. It is something profoundly kind of, I don't know what the word for it would be, but there is something profoundly morally important in that I wanted to write about and talk about and feel. So yeah, that's where it came from. I had no idea. It just happened. It just came pouring out. The first third of the book was written in a week, actually, which was quite insane and exhausting. And the language just sort of happened and came out. Yeah, but yeah, that was where it all came from.
Definitely see a hopeful note running through it, but because it was grimdark, I was terrified that everyone's going to die. But without spoiling the end, there is that, I think, a hopeful spring that emerges from it and takes us towards the end. So moving on to my next question. Your prose has a very lyrical, poetic cadence. To start off with, I thought why is this woman taking cows out in the field? and then a body washes up in the stream, and then everything starts getting darker and darker. But I noticed there's this kind of lyrical, poetic cadence. There's a lot of repetition that you use in the Sword of Bronze and Ashes, and there's almost a rhythm to the characters themselves as well, the way they behave, the way they speak. How intentional was that approach, and how do you see it shaping the reader's emotional experience?
It wasn't intentional in the sense that I sort of thought I'm going to write it like this, but it came out. It's utterly intentional in the way it ended up. That sounds really bizarre, but I just started writing it, but that was how the book needed to express itself. I'm hugely influenced by oral literature and by the transmission of poetry orally. So, my first degree was in classics, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were, of course, they were not originally written down. they were composed to be, they were spoken, and there's a lot of repetition and a lot of repeated phrases, because therefore the poet to perhaps to recite. So you'd memorize it, but you'd also have these kind of key little filler phrases that essentially you sort of throw in a phrase or even a set piece, couple of lines that were just sort of there as little structuring devices while you could sort of take a pause and restop where you were and what was happening and then move on. And you get the same detail in a lot. So most cultures with the pre-written literary tradition have these same ways of working for poetry and for storytelling, that you have these sort of little filler bits you can put in, and you do have a lot of repetition because, again, it helps you remember. And things like, so I really, really love alliteration. And of course, as soon as you start thinking an oral culture, if you're trying to, if you're composing something on the wing, or from half, or having to memorize it, to get a complete sentence that's alliterative and also makes sense is incredibly difficult. So when you can do these things, if you can have a sentence which is completely alliterative, or you can have a sentence which rhymes, or you have these kind of there's a wonderful, wonderful bit in the Iliad when Odysseus returns to Penelope and they recognize each other for the first time. And it begins with Odysseus' perspective. So it begins with Odysseus as the subject and Penelope as the object. And when you get through to the end of it, it makes sense the whole way through. But at the end, Penelope is the subject and Odysseus is the object. And if you think about how clever you have to be to do that without writing it down, that's a kind of that display. I mean, it's clever enough in writing, but when you're looking at an oral culture, to be able to put in those fireworks without notes, sort of is it's an absolute virtuoso display. So all those kind of elements are in the book, partly because it is kind of written down as if it would have been a piece of oral storytelling, or at least because I love that tradition. I have grown up, been lucky enough to hear people reciting a lot of spoken word poetry in lots of different traditions. I've heard people recite Beowulf, which is the great Anglo-Saxon poem, which again was written down but was composed to be performed orally. I've heard people reciting bits of I had my Greek teacher recite the opening lines of the Iliad to me, and a thunderstorm was going on at the same time in the original Greek, and a thunderstorm was going on. I mean, I've been lucky enough to hear quite a lot of oral literature, and it's something that I've just kind of really imbued. My father's also a poet and his all poetry is written to be spoken aloud, really. But he kind of, I've heard him perform. He took me to see Fiona Shaw performing The Wasteland. I saw a version of one of the medieval mystery plays, which is a telling of the entire Old and New Testament, but it would have been sort of medieval, performed in a village square, in a town square, or possibly in a church, but it's not scripted. It's kind of, there are conventions for what you do, but it's, this is not, it's a medieval play. It's assuming that most of the people are listening are not literate. And it's sort of, it would have been performed by a community. The actors would not have necessarily been literate. I've seen various mummers plays. I've seen an incredible performance of the Mahabharata. I've seen performances of poetry from a great number of different world traditions, and they're all part of me, and I just wanted to kind of, I sound like I'm just showing off now, which but that is a huge part of me, and I wanted to kind of write it, and it wasn't even conscious, but that's how it came out. That kind of, I mean, just the sort of sheer enjoyment of the spoken word, I guess. So that's why it is as it is, with the kind of repetition and the kind of poetry and actually a lot of all the kind of emphasis on cattle and hospitality and sort of that sort of thing. Again, it often comes from those kind of early culture in which you are essentially living on a subsistence level. Hospitality and your cows or your sheep or whatever and your fruit trees and things are incredibly important and have this sort of sacred status, because without them your children will starve. So that was a big element. And again, having come back from after COVID, that notion of what a good and peaceful life might be and what a rich life is was something that I was really thinking about a lot at that point.
I mean, it resonates with me because when I was 5 years old, I visited my grandfather's home in Pakistan, and they had some cows in the courtyard. They had a bunch of goats. They had chickens, and then obviously it was summertime, so there was still a lot of little chicks and lambs running around and everything in calves. And to me, having come from England, I found it extraordinary that they were living side by side with the animals, and these animals were a massive part of their lives. So that definitely resonates with me. So the book wrestles with cycles of war, love, of death. How do you see repetition in the prose mirroring those in thematic cycles?
Oh, good gracious. Yeah, again, that kind of notion of cycles and non-linearity and repetition. I mean, it is obviously such a huge part of life, that awareness of life and death, that life. There's often this sort of thing, people talk about how kind of Western culture is incredibly linear, and I mean, it's this slightly kind of, and then non-Western culture is not linear, and you're sort of, which is often pontificated by Western intellectuals who kind of, in that interesting way they often do when they talk about the non-Western mind and how it's infinitely superior to awful Western capitalism culture. But there is something in that sense of linear. A lot of Western literature, is very linear, and that very linear sense of time, which of course is a total illusion, because while we all die, life and its cycles continue. And I guess people living in very urban environments, we do kind of forget that sense of the circle of life. But it is true. It is kind of, and it was something I wanted to kind of bring out in the book, was the way that there is a lot of death in the book, but death is not this sort of terrible negative ending. Death is a natural thing. Death is part of the world, and they see death a lot. They kill animals. They see death. It has to be integrated and dealt with in a more positive way. So the kind of, and that sort of notion. I mean, partly the kind of notion of repetition and cycles. A lot of myth has it. A lot of mythological stories, you will have these strange things come in threes. There'll be sort of things will happen in threes where it'll be unresolved, resolved, or it'll be resolved, and then it's unresolved, and that's what sort of kickstarts the story. So with fairy tales, we'll have that as well. That kind of I think in the original version of Cinderella, she goes to the ball once. She goes to the ball twice. On the third occasion she's gone to the ball, she loses her slipper. It's that kind of things repeat and repeat, and then the cycle is slightly changed, and that's what sets the story in motion, or that's what resolves the story. So that was kind of a key part of, not quite consciously, but a key part of the way the book was written and structured, was to have those very kind of folkloric, traditional structurings of repetition and cycles. But it was also, it is that kind of sense of things not simply going from the beginning to the end, and then we stop, and somehow the whole story stops and the world stops. That there will always be change, and there will always be things going on, and the story is never told. The story will always go on and go off in different directions. Is such a part of life, and I wanted to write that, which I'm hoping answers your question. But this is such a wonderful podcast. Usually I get asked questions like kind of, what are your 3 favourite books? You're making me think much more. This is great. This is really making me think.
Have you ever watched I think it's the Hot Ones on YouTube, where the interviewer, he asks these really difficult questions whilst people are eating spicy chicken wings. So, so the chicken wings get hotter and hotter, and his questions get more and more detailed because he does research. So when I came up with my questions, I wanted them to be different from the what 3 books have you read most recently, and what's your favorite TV show, that kind of stuff. So I think it comes from being an author myself. These are the kind of questions I would like people to ask me. So
I'd be great on that kind of. I'd be great. I'm good at eating spicy food. I'd be quite good on that.
prophecy and myth bleed into the narrative with a haunting ambiguity. Would you say A Sword of Bronze and Ashes is a book of faith, or perhaps a failed faith?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's interesting. So I was born and raised a Church of England atheist, which is like the most atheist you can get, because the Church of England, of course, is essentially not really terribly religious at all. So I was born a kind of complete scientific atheist. But I remember a dear friend of mine who was probably very she wasn't admitted, she was very unorthodox, but very devout Muslim. She's very interested in Sufism and Liana, and I remember her saying that she thought I was the most spiritually religious person she'd ever met, because, which I was extremely surprised by, but I could kind of see where she's coming from, because, it is a book about faith, and it is a book about, there's that kind of sense of, so say I don't believe in a kind of interventionist God, but I believe in the world, in the importance of, I don't know, that beauty and compassion and such things they're not just words, they're the whole point of the book comes from that. It was actually one of the huge inspirations was actually, so there's the scene in the film of The Fellowship of the Ring where everyone at the council in Rivendell is arguing about what to do with the ring. And you see that wonderful picture where, the ring is, you see them all in the ring and there's flames and they're all arguing and shouting. And then Frodo stands up and says he will take the ring to Mordor. And you have that moment where you cut to Ian McKellen's face as Gandalf. And that look on his face, that mixture of just utter grief that this person who is a child, I mean, one of the whole really important points to remember about the Lord of the Rings, of course, that the hobbits are children. Essentially, they are essentially like children. They are the children being taken from their innocent, lovely little childlike world to this horribly dangerous, complex adult world, and being forced to experience evil and horror and grief and all the things that we protect children from. So that, Gandalf at one point, that horror that he's tried to keep this child safe out of love, and that incredibly importance of keeping the child safe and keeping them safe and innocent and letting them live in a good world, and that grief that Frodo is going to go out and be faced with the reality of death and suffering and pain, but at the same time that incredible pride, that sense that sometimes things are so terrible that you have to fight and die And even if no one ever knows, even if Frodo dies somewhere in the wilds, he never even makes it anywhere near Mordor, even if he dies alone in a forest 3 days outside Rivendell and no one ever knows, he tried to stand up and tried to do something. And it's not about proving yourself to others. It's about the fact that some things are so terrible, you have to stand up and sacrifice everything. And that kind of incredible dichotomy that, as a parent, I'm faced with every moment looking at my children, and that nature of, there is so much, the world is so full of suffering and horror, and if you can preserve one moment of beauty and goodness and hope and love for one person, that is so utterly important that it is worth anything, all the suffering, it must be done. So yeah, it's a book about, I guess it's a book about saying that you have to stand up and say this will not stand, even if there's no one to bear witness. It's not about, it's almost about, it makes it more important if you don't believe God is there watching. It makes it more important that you're standing up and saying, this will not stand. I will not let God see me. I will not let God see me as a coward. If you don't believe there's a God to see that, does that make sense? That kind of sense, yeah. And that, a lot of it, I think everything I write in this way is informed with that feeling, but that was very much about bringing that out and saying that kind of, that I always come back to Lord of the Rings. It's that scene in when the Rohirrim are riding to war to help Gondor, and they're riding down to the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and Theoden is pretty certain they are all going to die. He knows this is a suicide charge, and he's pretty certain at this point, Sauron will win, the whole of Middle-earth will be destroyed, no one will be there to talk about their noble, glorious sacrifice. In 3 or 4 days' time, no one will be there to talk about their glorious, noble sacrifice, because it will all be gone. Never mind, in 1,000 years' time, we'll still talk about their glorious, noble sacrifice. But still, even though they know it's hopeless, and even though it's utterly hopeless and futile, they've got to keep on to that hope, and they've got to make that stand. That's something that I think has been, or was imbued with me from childhood by my parents, and is also something, again, that sort of, look at sort of, there is such wonders in the world, and the world is the world is utterly sacred and must be fought for at any cost. So that's why there's lots of those lovely landscape descriptions as well. That's why I spend a lot of time talking about cows and flowers and things, because, the feel of walking through wet grass to go and call in your cows, that's sacred, and that has to be preserved and fought for and defended from the kind of people who just want to build car parks and data centres all over everything at all costs.
Do you think readers know how emotionally draining and stressful it is to be a writer, to wield all of these different emotions, all of these different visitors, and then expressing them and letting them pour out of you? So I think you did a good job there of showing that angst and suffering that writers experience whilst they're in the process of writing. From a sort of Bronze and Ashes, can we catch a glimpse into what we can expect from the sequel? Does the mythic cadence evolve as the story deepens, or does it take on new forms?
Yes, so I can show you the cover. It's is this? So it is darker and stranger, I guess. But again, it's a lot about love and the many forms love takes. And again, that the sense that love and compassion are more important and have to be fought for and preserved, and that kind of, and it sort of, it's much, it goes much more into the dynamics of Canda's family and how so obviously they're living through this, they've now lived through this huge change and everything. So by the time that when the book opens, they've gone through everything that's in A Sword of Bronze and Ashes. Things have changed a great deal for them. And they are trying to restructure their family and re-navigate. And they are having to kind of fight to keep that kind of family love going and to see the importance of fighting to preserve that. It takes you more into Canda's past and about kind of the burden of what she did. So, I mean, a bit spoilery for those who haven't read A Sword of Bronze and Ashes, but Canda has a lot of dark in her past. And I guess what bothers me sometimes, again, is that kind of, that sense that if you've done terrible things, I get in a lot of science fiction and fantasy, it can just be forgiven. There is that, the redemption narrative is a really strong element of a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I mean, obviously, I believe in redemption, I believe in second chance, I believe in forgiveness. I would never agree with capital punishment or for those reasons. I would always want to talk about the idea of forgiveness and redemption. But that kind of, so I think people often point out about Darth Vader, the end of Return of the Jedi, he's kind of brought back into, it's all right, he's made his peace, he's there with Yoda, and he's back to being a Jedi, and we're all forgiven. You're like, this guy, he blew up a sodding planet, kind of, he has done absolutely appalling things, but because he ended up telling his son he loved him, somehow that's all right, and he's now redeemed, and he can just say, this is really showing my age, but I remember this absolutely horrible thing. I don't know if you remember, there was a horrible thing, the Hungerford Massacre, which I remember when I was very young. This guy went around the town of Hungerford with a shotgun, shooting people. And I remember my terribly kind of woolly, I was at a kind of nominally Church of England school, and we had this very woolly kind of, but very, very woolly religious Christian teacher who sort of said, but, because if in the moment before the man who committed the Hungerford Massacre shot himself, he had genuinely said to God, I'm sorry I did that, forgive me, God would have forgiven him. And I'm sort of thinking, like, well, on the one hand, that I would rather think of God in those terms as some kind of, yeah. But the other hand, I'm sorry, this man shot all these people utterly randomly, and you're telling me, but if he told God with an honest heart at the end, I'm sorry, that makes it all right for him? I can't say, obviously I kind of, but it just seems that seems so simplistic. And there are a lot of those narratives, those redemption narratives in science fiction and fantasy have that very kind of simplistic, I was seduced by the dark side, but now, now I'm going to kind of turn and fight for right after all. And that makes everything all right. And I wanted to kind of write much more about Canda did some really terrible things. And those things, yes, people can talk about forgiveness, they can talk about redemption, they can talk about trying to make up for what you did, but you still did them. I think there is a danger. There's also that kind of, I think there's a danger I guess it's an element of storytelling. We want that kind of notion that people can be redeemed, or we want that notion that terrible things can happen, but that people can move on from them. And sometimes people can't. again, to come back to, you say to someone, you say to a child, you look at a child in Gaza, in Sudan, in kind of, you look at the families of that guy who was killed by ICE in America. What, you're going to say somehow, but one day it'll be all right? It's never going to be all right. Some people are, sometimes things happen and they break people. And that kind of superficial notion that often a lot of us have, who live very comfortable lives, that we can say, yeah, but it's all right because you can move on and you can find your peace. You might be able to move on and find your peace from being made redundant, but there are some things that happen in people's lives that they are never going to find their peace from. And I think it's important to kind of talk about that, and to talk about the idea that, there isn't, fantasy presents that kind of neat idea that you can defeat the darkness and have a happy ending. And I'm not, both on a kind of personal level and on a kind of world level, this is what I mean about I'm not sure this is what I mean about being accused of nihilism, because I'm not sure it is often possible. The best you can do is sort of say, but there's hope to cling on to. And it is horribly complicated. And, who am I to judge? Who am I to say Darth Vader can or can't be forgiven? But I think it's a bit more complicated than we sometimes make it out to be. And I think that's important to kind of to sort of unpack that and deal with it. Which makes it sound like the most incredibly bleak book ever, which it is darker, but it is also about hope and about clinging on to hope and about the fact that, yes, that people can be redeemed, because that is important. I think that the fact that Darth Vader can come back and become Anakin Skywalker at the end of Empire Strikes Back, at the end of the Return of the Jedi, is really important, and we do need to hang on to that. So it is about hope. It is about redemption. It is about simply saying, I care about you and I love you, to someone, should in itself be enough for redemption and hope. But it's also about the consequences of the really complicated moral consequences of darkness and of evil and of pain and suffering. So yeah, and it is a very strange book as well. It's because part of it's going into the way children think about things, which is of course utterly non-linear and often utterly kind of not within, and sort of slightly kind of unreal in the way of a lot of fairy tales and classic sort of fairy tales, and again sort of pre-modern oral narratives are not quite linear. That kind of, and then something happens which is kind of weirdly contradicts something that happened previously, because that's the way a lot of those stories, the mechanics of those stories work, or that kind of something just happens without explanation, because that's the way a lot of those stories work. And that's what I find interesting, is the stories that don't explain themselves.
Are you going to continue exploring the moral greatness of gods, kings, and heroes in the sequel? And are you breaking new philosophical and emotional ground?
I try to. I do try and always try and stretch myself. I try and make myself work. It's interesting because when I first started writing, when I wrote Court of Broken Knives, I've told this story so many times, but when I sat down to start writing that, I didn't even know I was writing a novel, let alone I was writing, the first volume in a Grimdark epic fantasy trilogy. I just sat down and started writing this scene of men in a desert, and then, massive spoiler alert for the first 5 pages, this dragon turns up, so I was like, okay, this is probably a fantasy novel. But I had no sense I was writing a novel. I didn't think about what I was writing. It just came pouring out. It was kind of an entire adult's life of frustrated wanting to be an author but not daring to be an author. It just kind of came pushing out. And now I do think about what I'm writing a lot more, and think about trying to stretch myself and trying to push myself and trying to kind of, I feel like I want to have something to say. I'd never want to be just writing a novel because I need to write a novel. I have to work part-time to pay the bills. I do not have enough money to live full-time as a writer. But also I kind of wouldn't want to do that, because if I was writing books for the sake of writing books rather than because I feel a burning need to push myself to think and say things and think about what I'm trying to say and how I'm trying to say it, and that there's something in this that's more important, that's more than just I'm going to write a story, this is the story. I kind of would never want to be in that position. So it's kind of, if I'm not, there'll be days when I'm just like, I really have no real idea what I'm doing, so I'm not going to write this. It's not about, and I have to know what I'm writing. I remember someone talking about kind of, for them, the challenge of writing is, you get your adventuring party and they're in a dungeon and there's a dragon outside the entrance to the dungeon and we've got a kind of enemy hordes and the dungeons, and how do we get out of this? And that's the kind of catalyst they have for the next chapter. And I don't write like that at all. For me, it's what am I trying to say, and what am I trying to make people feel and experience when I'm writing? And then the plot is really quite secondary to that. I guess the plot is the driver for, these are how characters are feeling, or this is how the landscape's making them. This is the thing I need to write about, and the plot is driving those different things, rather than the plot is what's important and how they deal with the plot is what's important. So I guess I probably am trying to push myself to find new new philosophies and new things. I think I probably have become a happier person having written this new series. I think I wrote myself into a very negative place writing Empires of Dust, because it was a very kind of cynical, empty. It ended up with describing an army taking a city in the great classic tradition of people like Genghis Khan, and that freedom. It was imagining, it ended up with that sense of what would it be like to be a person in an army participating in the sack of Baghdad, which, if you were one of the people sacking Baghdad, must actually have been really fun in an incredibly sick way, but in an incredibly sick way. And it got very into thinking what it must have been like to experience something like that, how different, how the human reaction to that would be, which is not an experience I'd care to repeat in print, I don't think, although I probably will, because it it was about pushing. Yeah, it was pushing. It was exciting, and it was, pushing language, writing total war and total destruction is pushing language and pushing human emotion experience to its absolute limits, which is one of the things I really want to do. So it was a kind of exploration of the kind of push. This must be you look at, or Alexander's Siege of Tyre, which went on for a year and was absolutely horrific. And looking at these great, monumental, horrifying military experiences, or there's this often very forgotten European conflict between Denmark and Prussia, which I actually go on about all the time. Anyone who's familiar with my work and on podcasts, it's not a forgotten war, it's really the war they know. There was the second Danish-Prussian War in 1864, which ended with basically the total annihilation of the Danish army, because Denmark brilliantly decided that a medieval earthwork, the Danish equivalent of Offa's Dyke, was obviously still going to do its job and hold off the modern Prussian army with howitzers, which, oddly enough, it didn't. um, and that is one of the early, as one of those wars where we have a lot of, because it only happened in 1864. We have a lot of diary accounts. We have a lot of letters from survivors, and indeed from people who, somewhat people who wrote a letter while they were dying in hospital. And we have a lot of incredibly contemporary reports by common soldiers in that. And those reading about those moments where people are just put in, the most extreme positions, experiences as is possible to imagine, and trying to imagine trying to convey that in language it's no different for me to trying to describe landscape, in the sense that it's trying to describe something which is either sublime or an abomination, and put that into words. And it is kind of the two sides of the same thing I'm trying to do, to describe that kind of sublime spiritual moment of the sunlight in trees, the sunlight, the sun through a tree, a child laughing, a world of that kind of sense of God is there, and to describe the utter abomination against life that is total war and destruction, are two sides of the same thing. And I will spend my whole life struggling to describe both of them, and challenging myself to describe both of them better and better. I don't really know why I've chosen that as the thing, but it somehow that's what drives me in my writing.
So I'd like to thank you, first of all, for giving me an hour of your evening. But before we go, I'd like you to let the listeners know what else you've got going on, when they can expect a sort of Golden Ruin.
A sort of golden ruin, a sword of golden ruin. So it's out in September and it's going to be out in the most beautiful hardback. So it's out in this absolutely beautiful hardback with sprayed edges, and it's the most beautiful book. And I'm so excited about it. And they're actually reissuing at the same time A Sword of Bronze and Ashes in a matching kind of very flash, beautiful hardback, which is really exciting. So yeah, those come out. That comes out in September, and that's obviously available for pre-order. The evil website we will not name, obviously it is available for pre-order, but it's also available through Waterstones or most of your good independent bookshops, or or direct from the Flame Free website, all of which I believe do little things like pay tax and treat their workers slightly better, and so than the evil website we shall not name, which is of course terribly convenient, I know. And then the Judge Dredd novel. So it's not Judge Dredd, it's Judge Anderson versus Death. That will be out. It's also out in September. So yeah, that's also available to pre-order from all good sources, and some not so good sources. And I'll be around at various conventions, and I'm also involved in running World Fantasy Con, which is going to be in Brighton in the end of October, the beginning of November, over the Halloween weekend. And one of the themes in that will be lyrical fantasy, celebrating 50 years of British Fantasy Society. It's also sort of celebrating lyrical fantasy and the sort of British fantasy tradition of things like the Romantic poets, who I'd argue, what is Kubla Khan and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, if not fantasy? But it's also, Beowulf, the first piece of written literature in English, it's fantasy. But again, that kind of notion of lyrical fantasy, of there being something more complicated, so that kind of, this all the discussions we've been having here would be really exciting for that, because that kind of notion, talking about morality and spirituality and faith and hope and God, actually God, not a superhero chap with a sword who's interfering in people in the affairs, of which is often what God means in fantasy. Actually talking about, the big questions in fantasy, I think, is a big part of lyrical fantasy, because it is exploring things that are more complicated. So that would be great to continue this conversation in some form there, in fact.
Call it an end there. So the book will be available from all good bookstores and even the evil bookstores as well of the world. So thank you for joining me on Fantasy and Faith, and hopefully we will see opportunities to meet up again, hopefully in person in the future. So until next time, keep dreaming, keep writing, and let your stories shine.